So I have been to the Itasca headwaters. I have crossed the beginning of the mighty Mississippi. And that's kind of like the charter school idea. Like it just started this little thing in Minnesota, and now 47 states later, it is the mighty Mississippi that flows out into the Gulf.
You're listening to the Bold by Choice podcast with Vashanta Harris and Jim Gunner. Real talk about charter schools, from the boardroom to the classroom. Powered by the National Charter Schools Institute.
Well, welcome back, friends. We are here for a very special episode of the Bold by Choice podcast. We are actually here at the National Charter School Alliance Conference. It's actually June 2025, so by the time this airs, it'll be a little bit later. But we're excited because we are here celebrating 30 years of chartering. And today, we actually walk through the timeline that shaped the charter schools movement. And in this space with us is something truly historic, the Founders Library exhibit.
The Founders Library began as an idea to capture the stories, the speeches, and the laws that made this work possible. We wanted a living archive, something our children's children could learn from. Because this isn't just history, it's our foundation. And the Founders Library is our map to inform what comes next. We are joined today by two people who know this story intimately. Don Coopers, whose research has helped document the movement's early years, and our favorite, Minnesota State Senator Ember Reichkott Young, the sponsor of the nation's first charter school law.
Oh, yeah.
I'm the only state senator you know from Minnesota.
Well, thanks, Jim. I'm excited to be back. This is great to be here back at the Alliance Conference, and it's just such a fun time, and there's so much energy in the room, and I'm so proud to be able to share some of the things that we've done to understand the deep roots of chartering, because I believe that understanding those deep roots will help us to lead more clarity. We didn't get to this point by accident, and we sure aren't going to move forward by drifting. So that's what season 2 is all about. So, as you said, I'm Don Cooper. I'm had the opportunity to be with the Founders Library since the very beginning. My work in this is a little different than others. I didn't come here from teaching and learning. I came here from the policy side, and that's really what's guided a lot of my work. And how do those policy decisions shape an environment in which teachers can do great things for kids?
That's awesome. Welcome, Ember, to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here. I am co-founder of the National Charter Schools Founders Library, and that has been a labor of love because it is so important to record the history of chartering. It's been now nearly 34 years since we passed that law in 1991.
Wow.
I was honored to be the state senator who authored that original law. It has taken many twists and turns since, and we'll talk about that today.
Well, that's awesome. Before we dive super deep into the voices and the stories of those who built the charter school movement, I wanted to ground ourselves in the moment that lit that match. And that year was 1983. A blue ribbon commission appointed by President Reagan published a report called A Nation at Risk. It declared in no uncertain terms that America's schools were failing. The opening sentence read, and I quote, "If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war." That report, friends, shook the nation's confidence at that time in our public education system. Suddenly, education reform became a national imperative, not just an academic concern, but a matter of economic survival and global competitiveness. The 1980s ushered in growing frustration. We had some ballooning bureaucracy, stagnating student outcomes, and top-down mandates that felt a little bit more like compliance than change. It was a time of simmering dissatisfaction, but also a time of invention. Some asked, what if public schools could be reimagined? Not by abandoning them, but by granting autonomy within the system itself.
Vashanta, that reminds me of my dad. He used to say, son, you change for one of two reasons, inspiration or desperation. But that's where the charter story begins. It wasn't a rejection of public education. It was how could we live the ideals more fully? It was a bet on teachers. It was a bet on communities. It was a bet that we could do more, that we could do better, that we could be responsive, more innovative, more accountable. We just need to give people the space to try something different, get away from the definition of insanity. And that's what chartering did. But that's the spirit behind it. Don, as a researcher and a student of charter history and somebody that's worked in the movement for a long time, take us back to 1980s. What was going on?
Just to step back a little bit, the context in which A Nation at Risk was written, the year that it was released was 1983. It was very early in the Reagan administration when the report was being written, when the commission that wrote it was being convened. And sometimes we forget why that commission was being convened in the first place. Okay? And the reason is because Ronald Reagan inherited something new at the time, the U.S. Department of Education. That was formed during the Carter administration. It was an outgrowth of other federal work that was going on, kind of a consolidation, a constituent department, if you will, to represent education interests and teachers' interests. And it was something that President Carter had promised to the teachers' unions. So when Reagan got in office, one of his first platform items was dissolving the Department of Education and returning more power back to the states and locals. And at the time, there was just a big tension about whether more power should go to Washington, D.C., or whether it should go back to parents in the form of school choice and an emerging voucher movement at the time. So A Nation at Risk is powerful because the reason that it was written, the reason that it was supposed to have been written, was to provide some justification for the dissolution of the Department of Education. What happened was the exact opposite. And when the team of people came together and saw what was going on, they realized that the state of our public education system was really a lot worse than people thought that it was. There was a rising tide of mediocrity. Teachers were overburdened. We weren't getting the best in the teaching profession. And it was something that really became a national imperative to do something to change this.
Don, you and I got to have lunch a couple months ago with Annette Kirk, who was one of the members that was appointed to A Nation at Risk. And hearing the behind-the-scenes stories from Annette was just priceless.
Yeah, that was fascinating. And Annette Kirk is the wife of Russell Kirk, a conservative thinker and author. And she was appointed essentially as the parent rep on the board. So you had a lot of very distinguished scholars from the university community. National Teachers of the Year, I believe, were on it. Other system leaders throughout the state. But Annette carried that parent voice through. And she was the one that was really responsible for driving home the point that parents are our children's first teachers. And that whatever we do in this needs to respect the individual decisions of teachers. And in spending time with Annette those few months ago, it was really a great reminder of how the work that we do in charters is a fulfillment of that promise and what was said in that report to return power and control back to parents.
So Don, I got to just say, in case any of my 7 kids ever listen to this, I need to be a better parent because I was their first teacher. Ember, I graduated from college in 1991. I was trying to figure out what I should do with my life and should I go into business, education, or politics. I was reading about you, your work in Minnesota. You were my hero. So to be able to work with you in real life has just been a treat. But take us back. What was going on and how did you get tapped to be the state senator that got this whole thing going?
I can't believe you were in high school then.
Well, college. I graduated from college.
All right. Anyway, all right. Well, I was a very young first year senator in 1983 when Nation at Risk came out. And honestly, I had no idea that it was, what it was about. I was trying to understand the ropes. And so I didn't see the things we were doing in Minnesota as very bold, really. I saw them as just what we did to try to bring opportunities for kids. I was happy to be a member of the education committee. And what I found was a very visionary governor that we had, Rudy Perpich, who somehow latched on to what was happening with A Nation at Risk. And then he proposed something called an initiative called Access to Excellence. And he connected with the Minnesota Business Partnership. Interesting that the business community stepped up and they said, we got to do something to change education here in Minnesota. So this is 1985. Okay, this is before, I'm really getting my feet wet over there. And they proposed something called post-secondary options and then open enrollment, which then became something that I authored. So my point here is that I was really just seeing more opportunities for kids, and I thought this was how everybody did it. But it was very different in Minnesota. Here's why. Our governor saw changing education as bringing more opportunities, more incentives, whereas the rest of the country saw it as, well, we have to meet more standards. We have to have more testing. So our governor was very unique about that, and that's why we were able to do such things like open enrollment and charter schools down the line.
That's really cool. Every time I get a chance to sit with you both, I feel like I learn something more and deeper about our charter history each time. And one of the things that I just keep like thinking about is how it wasn't innovation for innovation's sake. You know how people say, we're going to be innovative and let's go figure out how to do that. Like that's not what was going on in the 80s. And I think that's really important for folks like me who are a little bit later than that and maybe didn't live it and understand it in the way that I do now, to really understand that point. And so to keep going, by the late 1980s, as I understand it, there were a couple different voices that were becoming really prominent in terms of this new idea and what could really soon become the charter concept. And one was Ray Budde. And he was a professor, right? He was a man that was a really great thinker, quietly released a paper that proposed something pretty radical. And so I want to talk about a little bit about what Ray Budde's thoughts were. What was he proposing and why was that so radical? And I'm going to come to you, Don.
Sure. And Jim and Ray Budde have something kind of important in common, and that's they both earned their PhDs at Michigan State University.
Go green.
So just to kind of contextualize things, and first, you're right. A lot of what we see didn't originate just because it was a good idea. So thinking about the reactions, the context, the history that shaped things is so important because that provides direction to the future. And that's a lot of the work of the charter library. So understanding a little bit about Ray Budde is kind of foundational at this. And he did earn his PhD at Michigan State. He was a middle school teacher at McDonald Middle School principal at McDonald Middle School in East Lansing, which still exists today, and then went on to be a professor at UMass and Amherst, and was, essentially always an English teacher by trade, though. That was where his heart was. And what Budde was studying and proposing wasn't what we would consider to be charter schools today. He was looking at a way for the district to reorganize itself and for the district to do things better. So what he had proposed was, instead of having a traditional top-down bureaucratic district structure where you have a big central office, that you'd provide teachers with much more flexibility and autonomy to run schools. So groups of teachers would get a license or a charter from the school board to be able to run the school within the district. So it's what we would think of now as a portfolio district in some ways, high level of teacher autonomy, big level of choice among parents. Budde was the first to use the term chartering to describe that, the nature of the relationship. There sure were others before him that influenced that, but he's kind of where it started. But again, it's very, very different than what it is today.
And what's important to note is that when he first said that word chartering, it was 1974, prior to A Nation at Risk. So nobody paid attention to it. Why? Because they hadn't had this big report that said our education system was failing. So it just kind of got put on a shelf and put there for a long, long time. And then after A Nation at Risk came out, people started to take a second look at that. And that was really when he became much more known, and then where Al Shanker picked up the word from him at that time. But I also just want to say one quick thing too, Don, is that Mr. Budde saw the light a little bit later, and in 92 wrote Ted Coldery to say that, well, maybe it does need to be outside of the district. Maybe it does need to be new schools. So even his thinking evolved over time.
And that's the fascinating thing. And I know we're going to talk about Al Shanker a little bit.
Well, let's talk about it.
Going back and seeing some of the correspondence between Budde, Al Shanker, the president of the American Federation for Teachers, Ted Coldery, and the documentation around it really shows how the idea was shaped from being something that Budde had proposed as a way to reorganize the school district to provide teachers with more autonomy and professional opportunities. Al Shanker took the idea, and his improvement on it was that groups of teachers would be able to open new schools within the district setting. So rather than just providing teachers with the ability to run schools directly, they'd be able to innovate and try new things within that district concept.
And was that when the chartering word came back around, when Schenker provided that speech with the American Federation of Teachers?
He spoke at the National Press Club in March 1988. And, Al Schenker, as president of the Teachers Union, had a big national platform. So we had a column that was published. He had a lot of members that were listening to him. He delivered a very important speech in the history of chartering in 1988, where he used the term charter schools to describe it. He got it directly from Ray Budde, that was the term that was most appropriate for it. And he was different than a lot of labor leaders that we might see today because he was trying to advance the teaching profession more broadly on things.
I might add, he's the second visionary in this story. Rudy Perpich was the first, he's the second. You wouldn't think of a union leader sometimes as being this visionary reformer, but he was. And he was the first to really say, hey, we got to change the district system because the system allows the districts to take its customers for granted. We needed to do something to allow for that change. And so when I went to the Itasca seminar in Minnesota in 1988, he was a speaker. And that was the first time I ever heard of the word charter schools. And he was sharing how he had been at the AFT convention, the National American Federation of Teachers Convention. And he had talked with his teachers there about ways that they could be part of a consistent way to make innovation an ongoing and valued part of their school community. How can they be the leaders of innovation? How could the system partner with teachers to encourage risk-taking and change? So basically, what I heard this as myself, this young senator who is still learning the ropes, was, well, how do we expand choices for teachers? Because I'm a Democrat, I'm union endorsed, and I'm thinking, what a great opportunity here to make it better for teachers and give them more opportunities. So he truly was a visionary.
Ember, I want to come back to that, but I want to give 2 shout outs to some Minnesotans. So first is Joe Nathan. So if Joe were here, he'd say, you know what, you got to go back to Kenneth Clark. And that's going to be a future Bold by Choice podcast. And we're going to go back to Kenneth Clark and his writings and Joe and Howard Fuller and how they latched onto some of that and have helped propel it along. The second Minnesotans are my parents because they were born and raised in Minnesota. So I have been to the Itasca headwaters. I have crossed the beginning of the mighty Mississippi. And that's kind of like the charter school idea. Like it just started this little thing in Minnesota, and now 47 states later, it is the mighty Mississippi that flows out into the Gulf.
And what I love about that analogy, yes, from the headwaters of the Mississippi down to New Orleans, which now has basically a charter district. It's almost all chartered public schools down there.
David Osborne is here at this conference. They're doing a documentary on 20 years since Katrina and how charters have impacted and changed lives. But Ember, let's go back to you. You're now an author, Zero Chance of Passage. And I want you to just share a little bit about how that name came, because one of the things that really surprised me is when you told me the story that when you passed the first charter school bill, you cried. And then something happened.
That's true. The night that it passed, I was devastated. I thought that there would never be a charter school that would ever happen. And the reason was because it was so very compromised. But it was ironic. My house author, Representative Becky Kelso, who also should get a huge shout out here, had the tougher job in the House of Representatives. And when I handed her the bill in 1991, she told me that she had zero confidence it would pass.
Oh my goodness.
So it was my house author who told me that, which became the title of my book later on. And so when this compromised version of the bill passed, she was ecstatic. and I'm crying. But, you know, we managed to get it through because of 3 reasons. And one was because it was really bipartisan. Second, it came from the middle of the political spectrum. So people in the middle, both parties came together to make it happen. And, you know, thirdly, it actually was a concept that arose from outside the legislature, from outside the governor, That's usually where things start. But in this case, it came from a group of civic leaders called the Citizens League. And that was huge, that it really was from outsiders, community leaders, educators, labor leaders, business leaders who said, we got to make a change.
I just got a little bit emotional when you said that. Because that's your work and it's your passion, and I cannot imagine the time and the energy and the conversations that took place over time to get there. So another
Remember,
congratulations.
you were crying because it was so compromised, but you got a call or a letter from the top. Tell us about that.
Well, that's true then. And so I was devastated. I write in my book the morning after. I was just like, I failed. I'd been working on this thing for 3 years. And then about 3 days later, I get this word from the U.S. Senate that Senator David Dernberger, a Republican U.S. Senator, was on the Senate floor talking about this pragmatic new public choice option that had passed in Minnesota. And all of a sudden I realized, well, maybe it did have some value. And then a few days later after that, I got word that this governor from Arkansas, who was head of the Governors Association or the Democratic Leadership Council, was also lauding it. That was Bill Clinton. So between then Governor Bill Clinton, U.S. Senator Dave Dernberg, all of a sudden the door seemed to be opened. Mm-hmm. And so in the end, compromise was not defeat. Mm-hmm. Compromise opened doors. And frankly, it never would have passed if it hadn't been compromised.
Jed Wallace just found a great picture of President Clinton out in California, and he's got a lift the cap hat going back to when California had a cap limit of 100 charter schools. And that's the things the Founders Library does.
That's right.
And President Clinton came to Minnesota in the year 2000, which was my last year in the Senate. And he visited the very first charter school in the country, City Academy, and he just talked with the students. He shared with them and said his goal by the time he left office was going to be 3,000 charter public schools. So he was truly a huge help, and he was a help for Democrats who were, bucking up against the unions who were not as thrilled with it.
Don, the National Charter School Founders Library is showcasing at this conference 30 years of chartering, an exhibit. It's quite a wow factor. But you've been involved in tracing the growth and evolution of charters. How's this model growing? What's taken root, and what do you see happening?
Great question. And like any idea, everybody who adopts it puts a little bit of a twist or an improvement on it. And we've seen that in the evolution of the law across the countries. One of the really neat things to remember about charters, it is not a top-down proposal. Mm-hmm. It didn't originate from Washington, D.C. It came from essentially just everyday people and everyday researchers who are looking at new ways to do things better for kids and new ways to change the system to allow for more opportunities for teachers. So after that first law was passed by Ember and team in Minnesota, California was the second state to adopt it, mm-hmm. which allowed for conversion charter schools. So that's an innovation that we've seen. We've also seen the expansion of authorizing as well. Mm-hmm. So moving from the school board authorizing structure in Minnesota and California, we get to my home state of Michigan, where universities are allowed to authorize. And yes, historically proved to be a really important force to do things outside of the system. Mm-hmm. So over time, we've seen that expansion. We've seen a greater consideration of facilities funding. Mm-hmm. We've learned a lot about what are the pitfalls, what are the challenges, and also what are the common things that the enemies of chartering are going to try to use against us. And how do we respond to those politically and in the press and to mobilize parents so that we can do more great things for kids through charters.
And for all of you listening, mm-hmm. Ember's legislative colleague in California, Senator Gary Hart, mm-hmm. has an oral history in the Founders Library. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things we do. We hear the words from the originators, the founders. Mm-hmm. So if you want to learn more about California becoming the second state and why that mattered, right? Mm-hmm. There it is for you.
And Jim, I want to shout you out too. As our CEO and president, you are a part of a lot of this effort when authorizing was forming and with boards. What do you remember most about those days?
Nobody knew what an authorizer was. And they still might not, but they are important. I tell people all the time, the one thing every charter school in America has in common is it's got a charter that comes from an authorizer. And to continue to operate, they got to get renewed. So authorizers play a really important part. But in all seriousness, when the laws were passing, there was little thought given to authorizing.
Yeah, very little thought. It's fascinating going back in some of the founding documents where a lot of attention is given to the law, the opportunity for kids, and what teachers can do. And when it comes to the charter itself and implementation of it, it talks about some public body will issue a license for it. So not even a who, not even a what, very little process associated with it. So the authorizing community was really left to find its own way and evolve within this. And I think we learned a lot over the last 30 years in how to do things better.
And Don, soon to be Dr. Cooper,
Getting close.
says that charter school laws don't implement themselves. They're not self-implementing. And that's where we come in. And authorizers are on the front line of helping these laws get implemented.
So if we keep going, by 2010, over 1 million students are now enrolled in charter schools. And so you have race to the top, you have credo studies, you have teacher shortages, you have equity conversations, you're having the conversation about the sector. I know you don't want us to call it a sector anymore, but the sector was growing, and yet it was also going under a microscope. And then came the pandemic, a huge disruption to us all that forced every single school, every single student, every single parent to really reinvent the student experience and how they were learning. And so, Don, when we think about the middle years, I guess, of the charter movement, what did those years reveal? What have been the growing pains? And what are some things we should highlight here?
Yeah, great question. And those were some really fun years, too, in a lot of ways, because we were helping create a movement. So at that time, once we hit 1 million students, the charter movement really had to be taken seriously. It wasn't just a few teachers in a few places and some states doing something different, but it was starting to get a critical mass that the nation was taking notice on. And that's important when we think about the structures and the organizations that came along during that time period, because there started to be a realization that we can't do this as one-offs. We have to find ways to systematize, grow, scale. We needed support organizations. We needed advocacy organizations that were going to help bring this and make this more of a permanent movement on things. So during those middle years, we really saw a lot of that. I'll call it the formalization of it, the institutions and structures. I think some of the most interesting things that came out of it are the organizations that were created to demonstrate the efficacy of charters. So what were they doing? What were schools doing that were different, that were helping kids? What results were they getting? Because it was really easy for the districts and charter opponents to point back and say, yeah, well, maybe this school's doing something good, but all of them aren't. So being able to get credo, serious research studies out there, and a long-term approach to demonstrate that the schools and the people in them are getting great results for kids has just been a game changer in securing bipartisan support in the long term.
And Ember, after time in this work and you've been watching this ebb and flow, what's been the most surprising change?
Well, during those years that Don was talking about, we realized that we didn't pay enough attention at the beginning to certain things. And one was authorizers. You're absolutely right about that. The other was startup money that charter schools needed to have planning funds in order to get started. So that started to work through Congress and other places. And facilities. Facilities were really tough for charter schools, and some districts wouldn't give them the empty school buildings. So those things needed to be helped. I think some of the things that surprised me the most was in the politics, and that is how chartering seemed to take a more partisan divide during the 2000s, and not enough Democratic support. And so I think what happened is the unions were caught off guard a little bit at the beginning, and then they became much more bold in pushing back. And to be perfectly honest, in my own race in 2006 for Congress, the thing that defeated me in the primary was literature that said I was anti-education. So there was a real divide between that, and my hope, my whole purpose, even being here now, is to bring people back together. It came from the middle. It was bipartisan, and making sure that everybody understands that these opportunities are for kids. The last thing that surprised me, and again, somewhat of a negative change, is that some of the schools that should be closed are not being closed. and the authorizers are not holding those schools accountable. And unfortunately, there have been some schools that really should not have continued.
Yeah.
I'd just like to go back to something Ember said that I think is just so important, and that is growth and funding for growth and opening new schools. And we've seen the evolution over the last 20 years of the federal charter schools program, but a lot of growth just could not have occurred without the generosity of the philanthropic community as well. So people in the big foundations recognizing the potential that charters had and investing in the people to put those to work have really made a difference.
Right on. I want to give a couple shout outs, right? So one, all of the people that have helped build the ecosystem and support the ecosystem, because I'm going to link this back to somebody that's just had a tremendous influence on my thinking with charters is Ted Coldery. The things he writes, the ideas he puts out there, they're just different. They're deeper, they're thoughtful. But one of the things that Ted always wrote is that chartering is about creating the conditions where excellence can thrive, where people can try new and different. And I keep going back to that fundamental thought, even with authorizers, as we talked. Authorizers have a responsibility to help to create the conditions where excellence can thrive. All right, that brings us to now.
Yep.
We're rocking, and yet we got challenges.
Yep.
So let's talk about the future. Where are we headed?
Yeah, Amber, I'd love to come to you. If you were like talking to, let's say, a very new principal of a charter school, what would be some of the things you'd want that generation of leaders to really know, to hear, and to understand?
I would like every charter school leader to understand the origins of chartering and the why, because sometimes we forget that, and we forget the urgency from which that came, from which chartering came. And there's so much misinformation out there that sometimes that gets confusing. So these leaders who hopefully are not only educators but entrepreneurs, and they should be in that regard because they're doing something very new and innovative. I want them to have free reign, the freedom to be better, the freedom to create new innovation and opportunity. And along with that, the new leader, I need to suggest be an advocate as well. So you can't just be an educator and an entrepreneur, but an advocate for chartering. And they need to know how to message it to their parents and to their community so that it's very clear there's a difference between a public charter school and a private school. And this all will help them to build and grow not only their own school, but the community of chartering.
So, Ember, you've been in the arena of ideas for a long time, persuading public, right? Vote for Ember in November. Why 30 years, almost 35 years, are we still trying to convince people that charter schools are public schools? Are we bad teachers or are they bad learners?
First of all, that was Remember Ember in November is what that was. That was my mom. Yeah, thank you. Why are we, 35 years later, I would say the number one issue in America right now is that the public doesn't understand that charter public schools are public. Perhaps the library can help with that.
Yes.
I mean, the library is filled with people, pioneers all over the country, from Republican to Democrat, saying that very thing, that this is a new way, a new form of public education. It's not about schools. These are not just schools. Chartering is a whole new segment of public education, a way for someone other than the district to deliver public education, to bring more opportunity to students. But the fact that the public doesn't understand that has held chartering back. So I think with the recent Supreme Court litigation on this, where public schools and chartering as public is actually going to bring people together, because the public school districts and the charter public school folks are all now on the same page, making that important point.
And Don, with all of your research, what patterns or lessons should we be holding on to as we imagine the next 30 years?
Sure, great question. And the first one is bipartisanship matters. So part of why charters have been so successful over the last 30, 35 years is we've been able to hold, it's changed over time, but we've largely been able to hold a bipartisan coalition around the idea of chartering. I think we're starting to see some more pronounced challenges to that right now, but that bipartisanship has been a key to the policy success on it.
Mm-hmm.
The second big lesson over the last 30 years is implementation matters.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about a Ray Buddy or think about a Al Shanker, and they're both great people, but they took an idea and kind of put it out there and didn't do a whole heck of a lot with it after that. It took others to implement it first in law, and then authorizers and bold school leaders to put it into action in terms of schools. So as we're thinking about the next generation of what schools look like, thinking through the how and how to put ideas into action is really important. And then the last thing that it's really important for us to remember over the next 30 years are parents.
Yes.
So we've spent a lot of time and effort and energy when we hit that million mark onward, building up the systems, the infrastructure necessary for scale and for growth and for sustainability over time. But we never want to recreate what we were trying to change. And if chartering becomes more about the systems and the structures and the institutions than about parents, kids, innovation, and opportunities, we're going to end up exactly how some of the districts ended up. And we need to be mindful of that and just stay focused on priority number one.
Don, as an old baseball player, you just threw me a fastball bell tie right down the middle. People ask me all the time, what's the greatest thing about charter schools? And there's so many things to say, but the one I always try and go to is that nobody is assigned to a charter school. All the kids in them, all the families that support them, all the teachers that teach in them, they are there by choice. And we think that's magnificent. And why are we successful? Because people choose them. They voluntarily make the effort to do that. And that is where the engagement, the belonging, the sense of community, the heart and soul of our movement comes from, is the people.
Well, I guess if you're new to this work, you're in the middle of this work, or you're a veteran to the work, our statement is that we're all a part of the story. And so here's our invitation to you. Please visit the Founders Library exhibit and the Founders Library online. Explore the documents, watch the videos, listen to the voices that have shaped this movement thus far. Then ask yourself, what's the next chapter that you're called to write?
All right, that's a wrap for Bold by Choice. But if you are excited about what you've just heard, we've got a whole season coming called Legacy Lessons with Don and Ember. And you're going to hear about the origination and the stories and what makes this movement so special. So tune in, visit the Founders Library. Let's go make it happen for kids.
Thanks all for joining us on Bold by Choice. Be sure to subscribe, share this episode, and keep building with us. And we'll see you next time on the podcast where charter school leadership, innovation, and impact come to life.